Hi students, this is a little video clip about Chapter 4, which is our cultural context of practice. This is a really deep, in-depth, and long chapter, so I hope that you won't just skim through it. It's super important. We're getting to the time in the semester where you're going to start talking about the actual skill part that goes into practice. So the first 3 chapters have kind of provided an overview of social work practice, our values, our history, but when we talk about Chapter 4 and we start talking about culture, this is kind of where the rubber meets the road. Self-awareness is a big part of that. So I'm just going to kind of walk through some of the PowerPoint slides that I put online. Social work practice and the related policies are integral with the increased diversity of our population. Whether you're working in a rural area or an urban area, you're going to be working with clients that are different than yourself. So it's important to be mindful of that. Cultural competence is a term we use about understanding both knowledge about a given culture and then also ways to approach that culture. So there's cultural knowledge, there's cultural sensitivity, and then cultural competence. Differences of a given group, we all have them, so it's important to have knowledge about different cultural groups. Your book talks about core cultural concepts. It's page 61, and it gives definitions of things like cultural diversity, awareness, imposition, encounter, desire, sensitivity, and cultural humility. So please be familiar with each one of those terms. Then I've provided a link for you to look up the NASW standards for cultural competence. In Chapter 2, we mentioned that NASW has standards for practice in 14 different areas, and one of those is on cultural competence. So take a few minutes to actually look at what NASW says about our standards for the profession on cultural competence. We are raised to view the world and others based on the values, beliefs, and attitudes that we were raised in. And that's part of our culture. Harder for members of the dominant culture to really get it and understand. If you look like me and you're Caucasian and was raised in that environment, we oftentimes think that that dominant culture, that's the norm. And that's not simply true. So it's important for us to each assess our own self-awareness about the way we were raised and what things that we view as being the norm really are. Our values, beliefs, norms, language, etc. are all influenced by the culture that we are raised in. We tend to think of these being normal, and when confronted with differences from other cultures, we tend to view those as being wrong or deviant. That's called being ethnocentristic. Attitudes about oppression, not me, oftentimes many whites and non-minorities hold what's called a colorblind perspective. And we think that race should not and does not matter. This is not an appropriate view for social workers to hold. So we don't want to think of being colorblind as the same as being non-racist. They are not the same thing. There's a PowerPoint slide and there's a lot of information in your book on a COBRA scale, which is a colorblind racial attitudes scale. I would encourage you to look at those statements and find out whether or not you are colorblind, and whether or not there's some value statements that are challenging to you. Developing cultural awareness is a process. We all are at different stages. It's important that we not minimize and simply say, some of my best friends are. If you hear someone making that statement, chances are they may not be as culturally aware as they should be. So there is a developmental model of intercultural sensitivity that your book presents, and it starts with an ethnocentric worldview, which means there's denial, defense, and minimalization of the role and influence of culture. We want to move towards an ethno-relative worldview, which includes acceptance, adaptation, and integration. There is a cultural awareness and self-awareness inventory that asks you for a lot of questions. So I want you to take time to actually ask yourself those questions. Think about the role that your culture has played on your view. It includes things like describing a experience that you've had where you have felt discriminated against, or whether or not you view that you've been more discriminated against than some other group. So think about cultural awareness and your self-awareness. This week's discussion is asking you to describe your culture. There is a cultural self-inventory that asks you a lot of questions. If we were meeting in class, I'd actually hand you this handout and we would go through this in class. But instead, you're going to be discussing it with just a group of your classmates. You've been assigned to discussion groups. And so I want you to be open with one another and respond to one another and kind of make this what would be the experience if we were in class and you were actually talking about these things. Honestly, respectfully, and with sensitivity. Your book also talks about intersectionality. This is an increasingly popular term in social work, and if you look at the diagram in your book and in the PowerPoint, it's pretty all-inclusive. It includes all the different elements that go into our intersectionality. And populations are all the time at risk because of the intersectionality of many of these different variables. In terms of diversity and difference in practice, think about applying that intersectionality model to yourself and to your classmates. Think about how many dimensions of human experience across the intersectionality do you vary? It's a hard word to use. Think about developing cultural empathy, intercultural sensitivity, and then rating yourself on your open-mindedness and your cultural knowledge. In other words, do you know a little bit about a lot of different cultures, or do you know a lot about only one or two cultures? It's important to think about ways that you can expand your cultural knowledge. Think about how you do that in terms of gender, roles, religion, spirituality, roles on authority, etc. You're expected to have skills in dealing with cultural competence, and the NASW standards for cultural competence states that social workers shall use appropriate methodological approaches, skills, and techniques that reflect the worker's understanding of the role of culture in the helping process. So in addition to your discussion this week, you'll have an online assignment where you will respond to a case scenario and reflect some of your cultural knowledge in how you respond. There is a case study about Matthew in box 4.8, and after answering the questions and reading about the scenario of Matthew, I've given you a YouTube video that has to do with the LGBTQ population and your understanding, and there's some also additional links. Other special populations that are considered include children and adolescents, people with intellectual or developmental or physical disabilities, and older adults, and people with mental illness. So this chapter has a lot. These would all be considered elements of diversity. So oftentimes we think about culture just in relation to race and ethnicity, but when we talk about differences, it's much broader and more inclusive. So in summary, with an increasingly diverse population, cultural competence is essential for us as social workers. It is important not to hold a colorblind perspective, but instead think about your own self-awareness and then what knowledge you do have. Culture influences the decision we use to apply a particular social work skill when working with diverse clients, and we'll start moving into that in Chapter 5 next week. So hope you enjoy the reading and doing the activities this week. Have a great week.